My name is Tierney Powers, and this is my contact information. This is one of the hosts today. We also have a guest speaker, and he will be arriving shortly. But today, we appreciate everybody attending, and there will probably be lots of questions. So if you could ask those questions using the question box during the webinar, we will address those at the end of the webinar, and any questions that are left unanswered, we will call or email and directly respond. Also, there will be a survey at the end, and we very much appreciate your feedback so we can continue to improve. So today's agenda will be a quick introduction to SiliconExpert technologies. This will let those who are not familiar with SiliconExpert know a little bit about what we do, what types of companies we work with, why they turn to us. And then we will go into a demo of SiliconExpert. So we're actually going to reverse these two, most likely. And then Michael from the EICC will present an informative piece on the conflict mineral regulation and how it's impacting companies like those which you all come from. And then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So to kick us off, some of you may be new to SiliconExpert. I know we have a lot of attendees who are already existing customers. We are a OEM distributor supplier resource for component management. So OEMs, distributors, suppliers, and EMSs turn to SiliconExpert for component data. We are a component database of over 250 million components, and all of those are the basis, the foundation for our software tools and our integrated solutions. So we also provide professional services, and the tools that we provide we'll be looking at later on today and how the conflict mineral data has been populated into those. As mentioned, we have a very large database. It spans over the electronics vertical, not only ICs and discretes, also passive electromechanical components, wires, and cables. There are approximately 42 parametric values per part, and those parametric data points include risk analysis information, obsolescence information, also, of course, technical parameters and life cycle. The compliance aspect is also another big part, and so environmental data we track includes EU RoHS, China RoHS, REACH, conflict minerals, and mostly what we're looking to gather, as I'll show you later on, is the full material declarations and templates that support RoHS compliance and other templates that support conflict mineral compliance. So parametric information is, of course, inside of the database. It's pulled out of the data sheets and normalized so that one can find cross-references, etc. As is the topic is conflict minerals, this is something that to just give you an overview of where we are at today. We began collecting this information about a year and a half ago, maybe a little bit more, to support OEMs and other companies in the electronics industry to comply with this regulation. So today we have over 1,800 suppliers inside of the database with conflict mineral documentation or statuses, or both. The types of documentation that we're collecting, it's changing as the industry standard changes. But for instance, we have the EICC template, the CFC, conflict mineral policy, responsibility report, and we maintain all of those. And then today, now that the CMRT revision 3 is the standard, that's what we will be collecting. You can search by the supplier, you can search by smelter, And then you can also download all the information for a whole list of parts and suppliers in our BOM Manager tool. For those of you who are new to the topic, EICC stands for Electronic Industry Citizenship Coalition. C of C stands for Certificate of Compliance. So let me just check and make sure, but I think I will be moving on to our presentation. At this point, we are going to move on to the demonstration of how and where you can find complex mineral information within SiliconExpert. So SiliconExpert, as I mentioned, we really are a data company. We collect and normalize, we aggregate, normalize, and then keep data fresh. As many of our customers know, compliance is not the only thing that we offer help with, but that is what we're focusing on today. So the way to enter SiliconExpert is to log in. It's a cloud application using your secure customer login. And you would enter into our home page here. So the first thing that you'll see is that we are announcing this webinar that we're hosting at this very moment. This is where we have announcements, and when there was, for instance, the Japanese tsunami, this is where we announced that. Other times it's less urgent, but below that, here we have a BOM library. Down here we have an alerts area, and so this is just showing you the processes that we are helping OEMs with. So setting up alerts on their bills of materials to find out when a part is no longer compliant to a certain regulation or when a part goes obsolete. One thing to notice also is the support ticket area. So a lot of companies wonder, well, how do we focus on certain companies? How do we focus on certain companies as far as whether or not they are on our list to collect conflict mineral data from? Well, that comes from a focused list of all of the franchise distributor partners, so suppliers who are on major franchise distributor line cards, but also from our customers' requirements. And they can make suggestions as to which suppliers and parts we add, which suppliers we contact for conflict mineral information right here. And that's a very important way you can request us to add missing data. Any of these options, conflict minerals, part number or supplier, and we will get back to you within 24 to 48 hours. And that's a great way for you to communicate with our team and to voice what direction you would like us to focus on this conflict mineral topic. This is also another very good place to ask questions. Now, as you can see, there are different ways to look up information, and one of the ways is by part. So for most of parts, most of the suppliers, conflict mineral information is at the supplier level. So if I were to come into a part right here, I'm coming into the parts detail page, and down here we're going to scroll down to this conflict mineral area right here. And let me see if I can just make my screen a little bit larger. So as you can see here, we have this conflict mineral module penetrating into our parts detail page. And then you can click on the details to find out where are we gathering this information from. It's from the EICC template. Here are the details. They're pulled out into an easily readable format. You can look at the smelter and mining information down here. And so we have this information for just under 1,800 suppliers. And if you want to see which of the suppliers those are, you can come up here to the top right, conflict mineral button in the navigation panel, navy blue, right up here, and find a list of these manufacturers, a list of their status, what's the documentation, and so forth. You can search here. So for instance, you may be wanting to search for Texas Instruments to find out if they are conflict mineral free. At this point, they seem to be conflict undeterminable. You can click on the EICC template, look at what other documents we have, and then look right here. I think there might be somebody who is not on mute. If we could just, everybody be put on mute. Thank you. So here is an example of an EICC template. And as that loads, let me just make sure I did not miss anything in the presentation here. Yes, so I did. So as far as the way that SiliconExpert has come about gathering this information, here's a little bit of background. We have, of course, you're most likely familiar with the regulation itself, the Dodd-Frank Act, 1502. It's making tantalum, tin, tungsten, and gold, which is mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo or surrounding countries, not allowed inside of products. What we have done is we have determined the conflict mineral statuses by part, given that this is an electronics parts database. And we find that about 43% of electronic parts contain 3TGs. So we have a special approach because of what our specialty is, and that is data at the part level. So we can actually see what, for the most part, we have full material declarations, allowing us to see which parts have tin, tantalum, tungsten, or gold. Here's an overview of how passives, interconnects, semiconductors, what their breakout is as far as whether they're conflict-free or not, and how many of each category contains the 3TGs. Now, I might not have mentioned this, but this presentation will be available at the end of the webinar, and so we can send this out. I'll give you a moment just to read this slide. This is what the part of the process. It's a very general process overview. So we're determining the requirements, and this is how we approach each regulation. We determine the requirements, then we determine what's the due diligence necessary by our customers. We establish communication with suppliers, and then we determine which documentation we need to collect. So now going back out into the presentation, which we were in, here we are. This is inside of the conflict mineral module, and that's one way that you can find the information. Another way that you can find the information is actually at the BOM level. So if we were to go into the BOM manager, you can upload a simple list of parts. And I have one here just to show what it exactly would look like. So here's an example of a BOM that I uploaded. Manufacturer part number, internal part number. And then out came this report, which allowed us to look at information on this BOM, including what the match status was, and we can go through that as we look at the BOM, but also the description of the part. Oops, sorry about that. The life cycle status, the link to the data sheet, the RoHS status, whether there are any crosses or options from the same manufacturer available. So a lot of times companies are looking to replace parts that are high risk. We also show you the SiliconExpert grade, and that's telling you how popular the part is, how commonly used it is. And then here we come to the conflict mineral status, so in column O, and telling you whether it's conflict-free, unknown, undeterminable, whether there's an EICC membership with that company and the EICC, whether there's an EICC template attached to this supplier, and then any other supporting industry-recognized documentation. So the way that you would, we just exported that from the BOM manager. The way that you would obtain that report is I already uploaded that BOM into the tool, and since this is not a full-blown demo, we're not going to demonstrate that. But here, this shows you there are 4 pillars of the BOM manager, and we're going to focus on the last one. But to catch you up to speed, the 4 pillars are to scrub so that you validate the parts that you're uploading, making sure that they're accurate. The next one is the data, making sure those parts are active. You can see that there are 69 parts that are active, 13 that are obsolete. Then there's the alerts, so you can set up alerts to make sure that a part change is received by your company. So if you have a change that you would like to make sure that you receive, such as a not recommended for new design. And then there's also environmental changes, such as changes to the RoHS status of the part, or the REACH status, as that changes every 6 months. You enter in your email address, and you'll receive these changes automatically. Now, the part that we're going to really focus on here is the export. So here is where you can export any piece of data, and as mentioned, 42 parametric features, data points, that's what we have for most parts. So to export all of that might be overkill. Sometimes you only need 1 data point, and in this case, perhaps it's conflict minerals. So what you would do is you would select the box for just the data point you're interested in, come down, select here, conflict mineral status, EICC membership, all of these. You can select all, export that out, and here is the export which I was just showing you here, although I condensed it a touch. So I think I can continue. Would it be appropriate for me to leave off here and save time for our other presenter, Amanda?
Hi, Michael, are you on the line?
I sure am. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, we can go ahead and hear you. I'm going to go ahead and show your slides from my screen.
That would be great.
Sure, and we're going to go ahead and introduce you. So Tierney, if you could give Michael a brief introduction and maybe show his slide, and then I'll grab the screen.
Sure.
Thank you.
So thank you everybody for your attention and for your interest in this topic. And now we have our special guest today, which we're very excited to have. Michael Rohwer, am I pronouncing that correct, Michael?
It's roar, just like a lion or a tiger roars.
Okay, Michael Rohwer. Apologies. So Michael Rohwer is a project manager, and I understand that he was down on Capitol Hill this morning, which is why he was having me present my side first, which is we really appreciate you making time for this today.
My pleasure. Thanks, everybody. So I'd like to go ahead and get started. I've got about 20 slides that are here, and so I'll move quickly in the interest of time. So you should be looking at a slide that shows a beautiful picture of Lake Kivu. Is that where we're starting here?
Correct.
Excellent. All right. So I'm here to talk about really what the CFSI does in terms of helping companies comply with their regulatory obligations related to conflict minerals. For those of you who don't already know, the Conflict-Free Sourcing Initiative, or CFSI, is an initiative of both the EICC and GESI. EICC, Electronic Industry Citizenship Coalition, and GESI, the Global E-Sustainability Initiative, are both programs that emphasize corporate social responsibility in the electronics sector. But the CFSI itself is much more broad than that. We have membership of over 170 companies spanning a wide range of different industries, from automotive and aerospace to, of course, electronics, and including apparel and retail as well. So it's in this broad approach that we're looking at your compliance needs for the conflict minerals obligations, both in the U.S. and abroad. So the next slide, titled Obligations, really identifies the three main bodies of law that are currently in force. The first is the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010, which is a statute passed by the U.S. Congress. That statute requires that the SEC develop a regulatory rule, and that's referred to as the SEC rule. Frequently when I'm referring to either Dodd-Frank or the SEC rule, what I'm talking about is the SEC rule itself. Finally, both the Dodd-Frank Act and the SEC rule itself explicitly reference the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible supply chains of minerals from conflict-affected and high-risk areas. We usually just call this the OECD guidance. And so in a lot of ways, because both of these bodies of law reference the OECD guidance, that's what you should really be paying attention to. The question is, what are you doing as a company to help meet those guidance? Additionally, I'd like to point out that there's a proposal before the European Commission today that proposes to also regulate conflict mineral issues in the EU, specifically around obligations for companies that choose to do so, to certify themselves as responsible importers if they import certain raw materials. It also allows the EU to compile a list of responsible smelters and refiners that will likely be based on criteria similar to our own. So with this in mind, that these are your obligations out there, what's taking place today around those obligations? And what is the CFSI doing to help you meet some of those obligations? And even more so, how can SiliconExpert and other vendors help you meet those obligations more easily? So I'd like to start with a quick update, and that's the next slide. So only a few days ago, the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia here in Washington, D.C., ruled that the Dodd-Frank Act and the SEC rule both violated the First Amendment in requiring companies to report not found to be DFC conflict-free. But this is compelled speech in violation of the First Amendment's protections on free speech. The question is, what does this really mean? Well, what this means today is really nothing at all. Because what the court has done is remanded it to the district court, the question then is whether or not the district court is going to really do anything at all. And that's going to be up for debate because the court has yet to determine what it is that they're doing. The rumors that we have heard, and we saw a statement from a couple of commissioners that they'd like to see the rule stayed, is certainly possible. It's something that may happen. But as I said, it is yet to take place finally. So moving along, the questions about what's going on with the rule, as they may, the point is that we as an initiative and our member companies are going to continue moving forward, sourcing conflict-free from the region, and working on our initiative to make sure that companies have the opportunity to do so if that's something they choose to do. So what is the CFSI doing? And that's the next slide, really. Well, what we're doing is we're supporting in-regions that enable future legitimate trade from the DRC and the surrounding countries. We're implementing a program that audits smelters and refiners to ensure that they have both policies and procedures in place to ensure that companies that source from them know that they're sourcing conflict-free material. And finally, we're helping companies identify those smelters and refiners in their supply chain through the conflict minerals reporting template, which is a model I'm sure many of you on the phone are quite familiar with. And all of this is done across multiple industries in a collaborative environment that ensures greater efficiency. So if you take a look at the next slide, titled The CFSI Approach to Conflict-Free Sourcing, what you'll see is that we have explored the supply chain and really realized that as downstream companies, which are those from the smelter and refiner all the way to the consumer and final product, that we have a difficult time in applying business pressures to those actual mines further up the supply chain. So instead, rather than trying to focus on the mines themselves, by validating at the smelter and refiner level, we're able to create a system where we can maximize our use of resources. Because smelters and refiners are relatively few actors, and because they have visibility both down to the mine level and to the finished product, focusing on a validation scheme at that level in the supply chain allows for the most efficient and reliable system for ensuring conflict-free sourcing. We rely, first of all, on region partners to validate conflict-free mines and extraction sites. We then apply the conflict-free smelter program to audit and validate smelters and refiners. And finally, we use the conflict-free minerals reporting template to identify those smelters and refiners. That's what we call company assurance. The next slide identifies the high-level compliance steps. These are essentially the 5 steps that the OECD recommends that companies follow. This is the guidance that's explicitly referenced in the legal obligations and what we've helped build our program around, and something companies should be taking into consideration as they try to meet their legal obligations. Step 1 is about building a conflict minerals program framework. What this really means is developing a management system within your company. This can include training, IT systems, as well as defining specific contracts and those in your supply chain that you choose to do business with. It's important that this system be designed to collect and interpret data, and collect that data on the products and suppliers that may contribute to the conflict minerals. The next step, as identified in the OECD step 2, is to identify and assess risk in the supply chain. This is something that we find deeply important to standardize, and that's why we've helped create the Conflict Minerals Reporting Template, or the EICC JESI template, as some people know. It's a survey that allows companies to understand the role of their supply chain in their due diligence efforts. Using that template, it's recommended that companies review and respond to unreasonable responses in that template by using the own information they know and the information within the template to determine whether or not their suppliers have responded in an appropriate fashion. We next recommend that companies take a look at the conflict-free sourcing information available both in our COI data that we provide only to our members, as well as through those resources available online. We also recommend taking a look at some other validation information resources, such as other industry approaches, whether that's the London Bullion Market Association or Responsible Jewelry Council for gold, or what the programs such as EICC are doing in the tin industry. Participating in the in-region sourcing program, some of you may be familiar with a program called the Solutions for Hope. We also recommend using information obtained from industry initiative programs such as our own, but also some of those programs that I identified earlier. Another valuable resource that is not to be overlooked is directly communicating with your smelter to understand whether or not they truly understood the nature of the questions in the template. And finally, looking at other indirect information, such as where a smelter is located. That might give you a better impression as to whether or not there's risk in your supply chain. And really, that's what step 2 is about. Step 2 is about understanding where that risk is, whether or not it's likely that you're sourcing minerals from the conflict regions that fund a fuel conflict. Once you've done this analysis, taken a look at the responses to your survey, and compared it against information you already know, it's important for companies to make a determination as to whether or not they believe that the minerals in their product are coming from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This is typically accomplished by aggregating smelter and refiner data and determining whether or not the countries from which that material comes from include the DRC. If that's not the case, it's certainly possible that you may be sourcing from other regions or entirely recycled or scrap materials. One of the best ways to make this country of origin determination is by becoming a member of the CFSI. As a member of the CFSI, you're entitled to receive information regarding the sources of origin for all of those smelters and refiners that are compliant to our protocol. We refer to this as the Reasonable Country of Origin Information Data, or RCOI data. Step 3 is really about risk management. So once you've assessed that risk, once you've identified those risky elements within your supply chain, the next step, of course, is to manage that risk or mitigate that risk. Our recommendation is that this be done primarily through implementing the OECD guidance, through understanding your supply chain better, and comparing those smelters that you've identified in your supply chain to those in our list, as well as those among other bodies that validate conflict-free sourcing, such as the London Bullion Market Association, the LBMA, or the Responsible Jewelry Council, RJC. We list both conflict-free smelters that do and don't source from the DRC, and that information, again, is available in the RSCOI data we make available. Again, the goal here is to identify smelters and refiners within your own supply chain, but then rely on an industry program to help you mitigate that risk and identify those that are conflict-free. Working together in a cross-industry approach, we're able to audit many more smelters at a much lower cost than each company were to do it themselves. So relying on this data not only is reasonable, but it's specifically outlined in the OECD guidance as relying on an industry mechanism. To continue on with step 3, in the next slide, you see that we recommend identifying program improvements to support better data gathering. Whether this is to strategize on how to improve supplier smelter rates and accuracy by providing greater education and information on how to complete the CMIT. It may also include strategies to increase smelter and refiner participation in the audit program. So once you've identified those smelters, actively encouraging them to engage in the program is the most effective means by which to grow a conflict-free supply chain. And finally, modifying databases to meet changing compliance requirements is certainly something that SiliconExpert can help you with. Step 4 is really about using the conflict-free sourcing program to make certain determinations about the smelters and refiners in your supply chain. To help you understand whether or not that country of origin information it includes those covered countries in your supply chain, as well as whether or not those smelters or refiners are in fact conflict-free. Using the industry mechanisms help you make a sourcing determination that mitigates your risk. For example, if you have a company that produces a product, and that product's supply chains, smelters or refiners, are all CFS validated, at that point, you can certainly have validation that you have produced a conflict-free product and may report so to the SEC. That is then made public and available to consumers who would be interested in that kind of product. Finally, step 5 might be the most important. Step 5 is about public reporting. And for many companies, that means the reports that you need to generate and send to the SEC. If you've determined that the SEC rule applies to your company, and you've conducted your surveys and your reasonable country of origin information, you need to begin by reporting on what's called a Form SD. The goal here is transparency of sourcing information. The Form SD allows you to describe briefly what process it is that you've undertaken and whether or not you have sufficient sourcing information to make determination. A Form SD template is provided within the SEC final rule, but it's quite bare bones and not particularly useful. An important point is that those reports are due on no later than May 31st, but May 31st this year falls on a holiday, which means that June 2nd is the actual filing deadline. And finally, that report must be signed by the company on behalf of an executive officer. Executive officer is also defined within the SEC rules and does carry personal liability penalties for inaccurate information. So this is something you're going to want to make sure that you've vetted carefully with your senior management. But what's required within the Form SD? That's the next slide here. In the Form SD, under a separate conflict minerals disclosure heading, you have to establish some of the basic requirements about what it is that you've accomplished. However, if your company has determined that much of your conflict minerals in your supply chain did not come from the DRC or the 9 adjoining countries, or were entirely from recycled or scrap materials, all that's required is that you briefly describe how it is that you know that. Now, that's not likely the case for very many companies. So otherwise, all the other substantive content is going to be contained in the CMR, or Conflict Minerals Reporting Template. Regardless, whether you are only filing a Form SD or have to file both an SD and CMR, all of that information needs to be posted publicly to your company's website. If you are filing a conflict minerals report, which again is likely many companies here, the company's conflict minerals policies must conform in all material respects to a nationally or internationally recognized due diligence framework. And unfortunately, there's really only one of those out there, so you don't have a lot of options. And that framework is the OECD due diligence guidance. Like I said, it's explicitly referenced in both the rule and in the Dodd-Frank Act itself. So it's important to keep that in mind. And depending on what it is that you know or don't know about the materials in your supply chain, you have slightly different reporting requirements. For those products that are not found to be DRC conflict-free, you have to provide a description of the product, a list of the processors, and a country of origin for the conflict minerals in those products. You must also describe your efforts to determine mine and location of origin for those materials. Now, I'd like to quickly distinguish here that not found to be DRC conflict-free really means that you are aware that you do have sources of origin that fund or fuel the violence in the Congo, because you're provided an alternative for 2 years. That alternative is here, likewise for products that are DRC conflict undeterminable. If you do not know for a fact that the materials in your product fund or fuel conflict in the Congo, you should feel free to report conflict undeterminable. And in those cases, you need to provide a description of the product, again, the processors, the country of origin, your efforts to determine the minor location of those materials, and finally, your steps to mitigate that risk. That is, if you believe conflict minerals benefit the armed groups, as I mentioned above. So the important points here to keep in mind in your CMR is that this is really a description of what your efforts are. Not that you've actually achieved a full understanding, and not that you aren't permitted to source conflict minerals, but it's that you have an understanding of the due diligence obligations, and you're executing to those obligations. Finally, in slide 16 here, the question about whether or not you have to file a Form SD, a CMR, or in many cases, also undergo an audit from an independent private sector audit firm. We've created a little bit of a matrix here so that companies can better understand where their obligations lie. It's important to note that the audit is really only triggered if you make certain declarations. If you declare not found to be DRC conflict-free, or that you are conflict-free and source from every country, you likely have to undergo an independent audit. However, reporting conflict undeterminable because you do not know for sure whether those products come from those countries or not. An audit is not required. And both Form SD and CMR.
It's a hard time. We'll just try to make some of the ambiance a little quieter.
Finally, step 6, you're just going to have to do it all again later. So you might as well begin the process of understanding what your obligations are and making sure you execute to them now. So in mind, I'm happy to turn it over to questions as suggested, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Great, thanks, Michael. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and pass the screen back to Tierney Powers, who can show the information for both Michael and her contact information. And then I'm going to begin with questions. Let's see. Looks like I can see your screen, Tierney. Okay, so the first question we kind of had that came in, and you can both probably speak to this, is recently the EICC revision 3.0 has come out. Can either of you or both of you speak to the differences between the two forms, the latest form versus the previous form we were using?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. So 3.0 for the conflict minerals reporting template is really designed to do one thing primarily, and that is to align to the IPC 1755 data exchange standard. So many of the changes that appear in 3.0 are designed to do that. That includes, but isn't limited to, rearranging some of the due diligence questions on the declaration tab. Also an additional question and a bit of a re-articulation of some of those words. Some of the other changes in the template that companies should be familiar with is a new ID system for smelters and refiners. This is important because if you're trying to map your data from last year against this form, it's important to know that those ID numbers have changed. We've provided a cross-reference tab for companies so that you can easily see what last year's numbers were against this year's. The other thing that's important to keep in mind is that some of the clarifications to the due diligence questions and the additional due diligence questions make it a little bit difficult to directly map again year over year. So please exercise caution.
Okay, great. Let's see. Another question was referring to, I believe, your second slide, Dave, with the recent court ruling that companies don't have to publicize that they are or aren't conflict-free, and continued court cases by the National Association of Manufacturers against the cost of compliance. Is there any possibility that the concern of conflict minerals will go down? Have you noticed any changes already?
That's a good question. I'd like to make a quick distinction. What the court ruled is that filing not found to be DRC conflict-free is what violated the First Amendment, but not the reporting generally. So it doesn't seem yet that the reporting obligation is going to go away necessarily. And it doesn't seem like the issue itself is fading. In fact, the EU proposal, as well as a proposal in front of the Canadian government, suggests instead the issue is becoming more important. And this kind of traceability and chain of custody scheme is something that more governments are interested in understanding better.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's see. And so, Tierney, kind of on the same, I guess, take, a lot of people are asking what is the most recent template that the EIC, that SiliconExpert uses in their own conflict minerals module.
So going back to the question before, the original one just now, this right here shows you a comparison of the two templates, and we can send this out to anybody who would like to see it. Can you see it, Amanda?
Yes.
Okay. And then here, this is the original conflict mineral reporting template, the 2.03a, and then here would be this CMRT 3.0. So I can send this file over to somebody if they would like to see what the differences are, and outlined and called out for you is what has been added to make it easy for you to visualize and to work with. Does that answer your question, Amanda?
I think it does. Thanks, Tierney. So something kind of on a Tierney scale again, someone asked if the information we presented on 3TG minerals was gathered from SiliconExpert or from a third party. I just quickly want to clarify that all of the information that we use is from our own database. We have a huge database with a huge breadth of data. I'm sure Tierney can speak to that a little more.
So yes, that's a very good question. The data is coming from the supplier, and we gather data, aggregate it, normalize it, and then keep it fresh inside of our database. So conflict minerals is one of the most recent new data points that we are collecting. We've been collecting full material declarations for a very long time. We've been collecting data sheets so that we can have technical parameters. And now we're collecting the conflict mineral information. That said, it is the supplier's data that we are collecting. And so a lot of times the question will come up as to, who fills out the EICC template? Well, SiliconExpert will never fill out the EICC template. That this is the supplier filling that out. And if that doesn't answer your question, please feel free to follow up with me and we can talk.
Okay, thanks, Tierney. The next question that came up actually a few times for Michael, could you please go over again what CFS and RCOI stand for and kind of their significance? I think we have a few people in the audience that need some clarification.
Hey, I'm sorry, could you repeat the acronyms again for me?
CFI and RCOI.
Sure, of course, I'd be happy to. So the CFSI, or Conflict-Free Sourcing Initiative, is an initiative of the EICC and GESI. The CFSI is a cross-industry approach to help companies better understand the role that conflict minerals play in their supply chain. So we really like to say we do two things. The first is help companies who choose to, or help companies more easily meet their reporting obligations under the SEC rule and other regulatory schemes. The other thing we like to say we do is help companies that choose to do so source responsibly from the covered countries and the region. We do that through partnering with our in-region partners to make sure that there's transparency in the supply chain so that companies can report and source conflict-free materials from the DRC. The other acronym, RCOI, stands for Reasonable Country of Origin Inquiry. This is part of your obligation under the OECD due diligence guidance, as explicitly referenced in the SEC rule and in the Dodd-Frank Act itself. The RCOI, or Reasonable Country of Origin Inquiry, is a process by which companies explore where the source of their materials come from. Not the smelter's location, but where the smelter instead gets that ore. That RCOI data is a benefit that we provide to our membership so that companies can look at those conflict-free smelters and refiners, map them against their own company surveys, and understand the source of origin of the materials for those companies in their supply chain that are indeed conflict-free.
Okay, great. The next question I think is for you as well, Michael. We have a lot of people asking if the supplier giving the minerals declaration that it's undeterminable, what should be done? Is this a permanent solution? Involved with calling something undeterminable? Clarification on what conflict undeterminable means.
Sure. So first of all, I'd like to say that I am not your company's legal counsel. So before making any determinations of what you should send to the SEC, I suggest you speak to your legal department. Now, that said, conflict undeterminable is a provision within the SEC rule that allows companies to report that they are not certain whether or not the source of the materials in their supply chain come from mines that fund or fuel the conflicts in the DRC. So I don't believe that there are very many companies out there who have a clear picture of their supply chain all the way down to the source of origin. So to make things a little bit easier on companies, the Conflict-Free Sourcing Initiative, CFSI, has undertaken the process of auditing smelters and refiners. That audit determines whether or not those smelters and refiners source conflict-free material. So if you're sourcing from conflict-free smelters that appear on our website, know that the source of origin is conflict-free. However, if you're sourcing from smelters or refiners other than those on our website, then it's likely you have to either pursue additional inquiry to understand where those smelters and refiners are sourcing the material, or it's undeterminable. And that's why the SEC gave that provision in the rule for the first 2 years, so that companies would have the chance to conduct this kind of inquiry or survey. Now, what happens in 2 years when that goes away? Right, to answer the question about is this a permanent solution, well, no, it's not, and the SEC recognizes that. So, once that option to report undeterminable goes away, companies that don't know and cannot validate that they are sourcing conflict-free material are going to have to report not found to be DRC conflict-free.
Great. Thanks, Michael. That was very descriptive. Hopefully that answered the questions. At this time, I want to go ahead and remind our audience that we have a lot of questions that have come in for this webinar. I have all of your email addresses associated to who's asking the questions. I will make sure you're followed up personally after the webinar if we don't get to you. For a few minutes, I'm going to try to hit on a couple other ones, and then we'll go from there. So this question, I believe, is for Tierney regarding your demo that you gave a little bit earlier. We have a few people asking whether or not we have part-level declarations and where you can find that in our tool.
Sure. We do have part-level declarations, and those are found within our part detail page. So when you search for a part, you can find the data sheet as well as other information such as the conflict mineral declaration. And the other place that you can find it is inside of the bond manager in the rollout report. So as I showed you for
echoing. Michael, could you go on mute until, thank you, I think that's a little bit better.
As I showed you for that export report, there is an easy way to export out full material declarations at the part level as well to help with RoHS and breach compliance.
Great, thanks, Tierney. And I think there's one more quick question we can squeeze in here now. How does a user know that information from SiliconExpert is the latest available? Is it associated with the document?
So for accuracy and most up-to-date information, that's something that is very important. We understand that. And you know, what I mentioned earlier is that we're a data collector, and when it comes to data, it's not just about, you know, life cycle or environmental data or technical information. It's really about accuracy, how up-to-date it is, and how available it is. And so when it comes to SiliconExpert, we aim to try to our very best ability to bring all three of those qualities to our data. And for up-to-date status, we provide a last check date for all of our parts, and that lets you know when this data was last checked. We also have different attributes that are updated more regularly than that, like availability from franchise distributors. And so if you have any other questions or would like to get a better understanding of how we update, it is very complicated given there are 250 million components. Not to sound like a broken record, but it is a very, very complex process that we have in place. But last check dates are provided to let you know that the data is fresh.
Great, thanks, Tierney. So that being said, I think we're coming to the top of the hour. I'd like to remind everyone we will be following up with you personally via email to answer the questions we didn't get to. Tierney, you can go ahead and close the webinar.
Okay, thank you so much. I just wanted to thank Michael for joining us and everybody for listening and for asking so many questions. I can see all the questions coming in, and this is a record. So we will be busy getting back to you all and look forward to speaking with you. Thank you and have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.